The king of rock and roll was midway through one of his most popular songs, Can't Help Falling in Love. His voice filled the arena, deep and tender, with each note hanging in the air as if it were intended solely for the person listening. It was meant to be another great night in Memphis. But then, something happened that no one in that building will ever forget. From the third row, a woman's anguished wail soared above the music. Her voice broke and trembled, but it was powerful enough to stop Elvis Presley in his tracks. The approximately 18,000 strong audience went from thunderous ovation to a puzzled quiet. Elvis lowered the microphone and looked out at the sea of faces, trying to make sense of what he had just heard. What happened next was not on the set list, was not rehearsed, and could not have been imagined by the hundreds who crowded the Mid-South Coliseum that night. In one heartbreaking moment, a 7-year-old boy's final request collided with the world's greatest performer, and the show came to an abrupt halt. For a brief period, time appeared to stand still. Fans gripped their chests. The band looked to Elvis for instruction as their instruments fell silent. And then, before anyone could understand what was going on, Elvis Presley made a decision that transformed a concert into a historical moment, leaving every single person in the audience in tears. It was September 15th, 1975. The Mid-South Coliseum in Memphis, Tennessee, was charged with electricity. Elvis Presley was back on his home soil, doing his second show of the evening, and the enthusiasm was unlike anything most fans had ever experienced. The King had already released a succession of successes, including That's All Right, Hound Dog, and Burning Love. Each song got the audience on their feet, their voices almost drowning out his own as they sang along. Security officers tried to maintain order as fans rushed closer to the platform, hoping for a sight of their idol. The flashes of cameras illuminated the gloomy arena, adding to the sensation that everyone inside was a part of something larger than themselves. Then came the shift, the period of the night Elvis always saved for something slower, more intimate. He leaned over the microphone with that conversational appeal that made each fan feel as if he was singing just for them. As the first chords of Can't Help Falling in Love rang out in the Coliseum, the cheers faded into calm expectancy. Couples leaned into one another. Parents lifted their youngsters onto their shoulders to get a better view. The mood shifted from tremendous exhilaration to tenderness, almost sacredness. Nobody knew then that the show was going to change forever. For the 18,000 people in attendance, it was just another fantastic night with Elvis Presley at the peak of his powers. But in the third row, over to the side, sat a young child whose life was slipping away. And before the last note of that love ballad was sung, his silent presence transformed this concert into one of the most dramatic performances in music history. While the rest of the audience was engrossed in the spectacle, a weak little boy sat in the third row, his presence carrying more weight than anyone in the room could have guessed. His name was Danny Sullivan. He was just 7 years old, and he was dying. Danny had been fighting leukemia for 2 years, which no child should ever have to suffer. The sickness had sapped his vitality, stolen his hair, and kept him in and out of hospital beds while other children his age were playing on playgrounds. By that September night, the physicians had delivered a verdict that no parent wants to hear. Their son had only a few hours or days to live. Faced with the unimaginable, Danny's parents, Tom and Margaret, made one final decision. They would grant their boy's final wish. Danny murmured, "Mama, before I go, I want to see Elvis." It sounded impossible. The tickets were long gone. The show had sold out. And even if there were seats available, who would give them up with only a few hours left? However, Tom Sullivan, a mechanic who had never asked for favors in his life, spent the entire day on the phone. He begged, pleaded, and contacted anyone who could have a connection. He was a father on a mission, and nothing, not pride or exhaustion, was going to stop him. By some miracle, barely 2 hours before the concert, A buddy of a friend arrived. 3 seats had opened up. They weren't in the front row, but they were close enough to watch the king of rock and roll in his full majesty. That was enough. Danny was too weak to walk into the Coliseum that night, so Tom carried him there. He donned his favorite Elvis t-shirt, big and saggy on his small frame, with a baseball cap pulled low to conceal his bald head. Danny's eyes lit up for the first time in weeks with something other than pain. He was no longer a patient. He was not a boy on borrowed time. He was only a fan, one of thousands who waited for Elvis to enter the stage. As the lights darkened and the first chords rang out, Danny's wish came true. When the first spotlight hit the stage and Elvis appeared in his white jumpsuit, the entire audience burst out in shouts. But in the third row, young Danny's reaction was more subdued. His lips twisted into a small smile, his eyes wide with amazement. For him, this was more than simply amusement. This was heaven on earth. Danny, who was fragile, leaned heavily against his mother's arm as Tom gently placed him in his seat. His baseball cap slid slightly, exposing the smooth scalp that chemotherapy had left behind. But he didn't mind. He was too busy clapping along with the rest of the crowd, absorbing every sound and movement of the man he had admired from a distance. For the first hour, Danny pretended he wasn't sick. Despite the discomfort in his small body, he moved to the music, mouthing each line, his tiny voice drowned out by the noise of 18,000 followers. During a lull between songs, he tugged on his mother's sleeve and said, "Mama, this is the best day ever." Margaret tried to smile through her tears, knowing he was right, that this may also be his last day of happiness. As Elvis moved into a softer section of his concert, the lights darkened and the band slowed to the opening notes of "Can't Help Falling in Love." Danny's eyes brightened up immediately. This wasn't simply another Elvis classic. It was his song. His mother had sang him a lullaby every night before going to bed. When the pain became too intense, he would listen to this song to calm himself down. And here it was. Elvis Presley sang live in front of him, singing the words that had carried him through the darkest nights. Danny grasped his mother's hand. For a few precious minutes, everything was great. Elvis was halfway through "Can't Help Falling in Love," his voice soft and gentle, when it happened. A single shriek sliced through the music, piercing enough to quiet the entire band behind him. "Elvis, please, my son is dying!" The words originated from the third row. Elvis halted, his face twisting in perplexity as the audience murmured. The band faltered, with each instrument drifting off one by one. Within seconds, the noise of 18,000 supporters faded into unnerving silence. Everyone turned towards the voice. Margaret Sullivan stood there, holding her young boy in her arms. Danny's baseball cap had loosened, making his weak body obvious even under the stage lights. His mother's despair was obvious. She shouted again, her voice shaking, "He doesn't have much time! Please, he loves you so much!" You could sense the atmosphere change in the Coliseum. It had been a concert just moments before, but now it was completely different. Parents clutched their youngsters more tightly. Strangers gazed in startled disbelief. The silence was so perfect that you could hear the faint buzzing of the amplifiers. Elvis walked forward, peering into the lights to make out the figure among the crowd. "Ma'am?" he asked carefully, microphone still in hand. "What did you just say?" Margaret raised Danny higher, her tears glittering in the stage lights. "This is my son," she exclaimed. "His name is Danny. He's just 7. The doctors gave him hours to survive. All he wanted was to see you." The whole arena held its breath. Then, in a scarcely discernible voice, Danny gathered his strength and said, "I love you, Elvis." These 5 words broke the king of rock and roll. In that instant, everything changed. Elvis stood there motionless, microphone hanging loosely in his palm. He was no longer just a performance. He was a guy staring directly into the eyes of a mother about to lose her kid. Thousands of people gathered in the arena, waiting to see what he would do. Finally, Elvis leaned over the microphone, his voice quiet but steady. "What is your name, son?" he asked. Danny lifted his head with the little power he had left. He replied in a quivering but clear voice, "Danny Sullivan. I love you, Elvis." The word struck Elvis like a physical blow. He looked away from the audience for a bit, blinking hard, his shoulders rising and falling as he sought to gather himself. Then he faced his band and announced firmly, "Boys, we're taking a break." Confused looks darted over the stage. Shows weren't intended to end like this. But Elvis didn't ask. He was making a decision. He went back to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," then he faced his band and announced firmly, "Boys, we're taking a break." Confused looks darted over the stage. Shows weren't intended to end like this. But Elvis didn't ask. He was making a decision. He went back to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice breaking slightly, "I need you to be patient with me for a few minutes. There's something going here tonight that is more important than the concert." With that, Elvis set the microphone down on the piano, got off stage, and began approaching the Sullivans. The audience erupted, not with cheers this time, but with astonished quiet, a communal realization that they were watching something precious. Security reacted immediately to clear a path. Elvis motioned to his road manager, Joe Esposito. "Get that family backstage," he instructed. Joe paused, reminding him of the timeline, but Elvis interrupted him abruptly. "That young boy is dying. He came to see me, and I'll be damned if he only gets a glance from the third row." In that moment, Elvis Presley changed the definition of what a concert could be. The Sullivan family was swiftly led backstage, still astonished by what had just happened. Tom held Danny in his arms, his small body slack from tiredness, but his eyes bright with surprise. Margaret gripped her husband's sleeve, overwhelmed by the impossibility of the situation. Elvis walked into his changing room a few steps ahead of them, already loosening the rhinestone collar of his jumpsuit. When the family went in, the king of rock and roll did not stand like a celebrity waiting for fans. He knelt down, eye level with a toddler who had just proclaimed his love to the throng. "Hey there, Danny," Elvis replied quietly, his voice free of artifice, warm and genuine. "Your mama tells me you're a fan of mine." Danny nodded softly, his lips forming a faint smile. "I listen to Love Me Tender every night," he said softly. "It helps me not be scared." Elvis's eyes glistened. He reached for Danny's hand and gently took it on his own. "Do you know what, buddy? That's also my favorite." He paused, then asked, "Would you like me to sing it for you?" "Just us here. No stage, no lights." Danny's eyes expanded. Even in his frail state, delight shone across his features. He nodded. Elvis sat down on the edge of the couch where Danny had been lying. Without a microphone or an orchestra, he began singing. His voice was lower than the thunderous tone that had filled the Coliseum, yet it was more forceful than any of his previous performances. Every syllable was a promise, and each note a prayer. "Love me tender, love me sweet, never let me go." Margaret covered her mouth and sobbed silently. Tom averted his gaze, tears running down a man who seldom sobbed. In that modest room, the king of rock and roll was no longer a star. He was just a man, providing comfort to a youngster who needed it the most. And in those few minutes, backstage at the Mid-South Coliseum, a dying youngster received the most precious gift he could possibly have, Elvis Presley's heart. After a few quiet moments backstage, Elvis surprised even his closest staff members. He carefully gathered Danny into his arms, cradling the fragile boy against his chest as he was carrying his own child. Without hesitation, he turned back to face the stage. When Elvis appeared, the audience erupted in cheers until they saw what he was holding. The celebrations quickly turned to stillness as the spotlight revealed a young, frail boy in Elvis's arms. You could hear gasps echoing across the Coliseum. Elvis approached the microphone, his voice heavy with emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen," he continued softly, "I'd like you to meet my friend, Danny Sullivan." Danny is 7 years old and has been battling a war that no little kid should have to face. But I'll tell you something. He looked down at the boy and back at the throng. He's braver than any of us standing here tonight. The audience erupted in a flood of applause, not the wild, frenetic cheers that normally greeted Elvis, but something softer, deeper, and more respectful. It was the kind of clapping reserved for occasions that felt more significant than entertaining. Elvis placed down upon the piano bench, holding Danny in his lap. Danny's favorite song, he told the audience, is "Love Me Tender," and tonight we'll sing it together. The band began quietly, their playing muted, as if they knew the gravity of the situation. Elvis began the first lyric, his voice powerful and steady. Danny finally joined in, terrified. His weak voice faltered, but it traveled through the microphone and across the arena. 18,000 people remained silent while Elvis Presley and a dying kid sang together. Then something unusual happened. The audience started singing as well. Not loudly, not with the boisterous energy of a concert crowd, but softly, almost like a lullaby. The Coliseum transformed into a choir, engulfing Danny in a blanket of love that seemed to stop time. Tears streamed down everyone's cheeks at the end of the song. Grown men wept. The teenagers sobbed into their hands. Parents drew their youngsters closer. On that stage, no one saw a celebrity or his fans. They witnessed humanity at its purest. And at the heart of it all was a young child who, for one night, felt like the most important person on the planet. As the last notes of "Love Me Tender" faded, Elvis leaned down and whispered something into Danny's ear, words only he could hear. Whatever was said, Danny smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that his parents hadn't seen in weeks. Then came the unexpected moment. Danny reached up with unsteady hands, removing the baseball cap he'd been wearing all night to cover the bare scalp left by chemotherapy. He carefully positioned it on Elvis's head. "For you," he said softly, "so you remember me." The king of rock and roll broke down on stage. Tears streamed down his cheeks and his voice caught as he attempted to collect himself. Elvis Presley, larger than life, untouchable and adored, was suddenly just a guy overcome by the love of a child in front of an audience of 18,000. He wore that cap throughout the rest of the show. Every song that followed sounded unique, packed with real passion that left the audience silent and reverent. It was no longer about rock and roll, it was all about connection. When the show concluded, Elvis did not flee to the shelter of his entourage. Instead, he spent over an hour with the Sullivans backstage. He gave Danny one of his scarves, autographed photos, and promised to see him again. And here's the miracle. Danny did not die that night, or the next. Against all odds, the tiny kid who wasn't supposed to see the sunrise lived for another 6 months, which his family never expected. Danny Sullivan died in March 1976, 6 months after the incredible night. His parents stated he died quietly, wrapped in the scarf Elvis had given him and soothed by the memories of the music they shared. For them, those 6 months were a miracle, filled with joy, family memories, and the fortitude that came from knowing their little boy's final desire had been granted. Elvis was deeply affected by the experience. From that day on, he made an effort to look deeper into the crowds at his shows. He sought out sick children, families in need of comfort, and fans who were carrying unseen burdens. Friends later stated that following Danny, Elvis began to view his concerts as opportunities to rehabilitate, even if only for a night. When Elvis died a year later, Danny's baseball cap remained one of his most beloved possessions at Graceland. The narrative did not end there. Years later, Danny's parents established the Danny Sullivan Foundation, which grants final wishes to terminally sick children. Thousands of families have found consolation as a result of one small boy's bravery and one celebrity's kindness. It serves as a reminder that sometimes the greatest legacies are formed through a single act of compassion rather than fame or prosperity. Elvis paused his act for Danny Sullivan, but in doing so, he taught the world a lesson about compassion. If this story impacted you, please subscribe, like, and share this video with someone who needs to be reminded of the power of kindness. And in the comments, tell us whether you've ever seen someone stop everything to help another person. Because sometimes the tiniest gestures have the most impact.